Hello and welcome again to the fifth edition of the Ground Check discussions hosted by the German Archaeological Institute. I'm Volkart Wildermuth, science journalist. I will lead you through the evening. We will again discuss the impact of climate change on cultural heritage. Last week, we heard about the impact of water, of floods and rising sea levels on temples and castles on the seaside. This week, we go to the root of the problem, the rising temperatures itself. Heat waves are deadly for people in temperate regions. They can be devastating for plants, for animals. They can change whole landscapes. We've seen glaciers melting right before our eyes in the Alps and other mountains. And when we move up north, the permafrost falls in Alaska and Siberia. This not only sets free huge amount of methane, a potent greenhouse gas, but it endangers frozen archaeology sites that were especially well preserved. So let's begin with the Ground Check session 5, impact of climate change on cultural heritage, warming. We will again start off with 4 short presentations. Then there will be a discussion among the speakers on the panel. And finally, all of you can ask questions. You can use a chat function within Zoom. You can use Facebook. You can join in via Twitter. And I will try to weave in your questions or we come back to them at the end discussion. Our speakers today are Professor Henny Piezonka. She's an ethno-archaeologist of northern latitudes from the University of Kiel. Then there's Dr. Sabine Reinhold. She's part of the Eurasia department of the German Archaeology Institute here in Berlin. And she's responsible for the archaeology of Siberia and the Urals. Archaeologist Dr. Jensen joins us from the University of Alaska Fairbanks in Barrow. We appreciate that you got up early for this discussion. And finally, we have Dr. Martin Callanan from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in Trondheim, a specialist for glacial archaeology. Yes, temple and graveyards is a picture of archaeology in the mind of the public, but excavations in the far north, they might not be that flashy, but they deliver exquisitely preserved remains. What will we lose when warmer climates thaw the permafrost? Dr. Henny Piezonka.
Thank you, Mr. Wildermuth, for this introduction. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to open today's session in this conference with an introductory paper on our topic, climate change and the archaeological heritage of the Arctic and subarctic. A brief review of press releases on the wider topic reveals the surprising situation that the most interesting topic for the public apparently is the releasing of ancient germs from the ice. For example, this BBC note of 30,000-year-old giant viruses coming back to life. However, from our more scientific point of view, this is actually not the key problem, but there are actually other challenges connected to Arctic warming, which are of more importance from an archaeological, but also heritage point of view. One of them is concerning the past archives and the lessons on climate change and climate-related hazards and on coping strategies we can draw from them. And the other topic of much importance is the endangered cultural heritage and the challenges for documentation and preservation. In the first session of our conference, you have already seen the marvelous introduction by Detlef Cronenborn, who showed us how past archives can be studied and used to inform us about impact of socio-environmental hazards in the long term and in deep histories, to find out about consequences of intensity and timing, and most importantly, maybe to reveal how human responses and coping strategies are mitigated and have been mitigated over the deep past. I would like to show you a very stark example of how climate change can affect human societies and the environment by the example of Doggerland, the vast stretch of land in the area which today is the North Sea, which disappeared around 8,200 years ago connected to a climatic event, to a worldwide cooling event, actually, which is connected to the changes of the Gulf Stream, which in turn is actually connected to global warming at that stage, because melting glaciers in North America caused a massive influx of fresh water into the Atlantic Ocean, which in turn changed the course of the Gulf Stream and led to this Dorega landslide, for example, which sort of finished Doggerland off. This climatic changes around 8,200 years ago was actually quite a global event. And we can see its effects also in remote regions of Western Siberia, where at exactly that time, and a very peculiar set of innovations and transformations took hold of the human societies of the hunter-gatherers dwelling in these forests. They came to use the oldest fortified settlements in the world. They started to use pottery vessels. They found the innovation of ritual mounds in the landscape, and so on. And on the slide, you also see another aspect, which the other talks today, especially Sabine Reinhold's talk, will show you more today, which is the incredible preservation of human impact and human heritage over many millennia in the Arctic environments. Here you see a pit house, which has preserved as a very clear depression in the ground for more than 8,000 years. A third aspect concerning these past archives I'd like to raise here is the necessity of the collaboration of archaeology and social and cultural anthropology concerning the Arctic climate change. Because in dialogue with indigenous communities, but also with anthropologists, we can take into view the deeper histories of traditional ways of knowing, of tipping points and coping strategies, and hopefully learn also for our current situation. The second large topic I would like to raise your attention briefly to is the cultural heritage in cryospheres. And on this slide, you just see a little overview, and there's more to come in the other talks today, of what the permafrost can preserve. Wooden artifacts, settlement structures, mummies even. Here you see, for example, a mammoth mummy, but also the famous Ötzi, bone tools, and so on, are all specifically preserved in these permafrost conditions. And they are a legacy for us as archaeologists and as scientists to be preserved. An emerging field connected to climate change is glacier archaeology. Again, we will hear about this by one of the talks today, some more, which is an ambivalent thing because it is a cause, yes, it has been caused by the climatic change, but at the same time, it opens up new archives for us to reconstruct past conditions and societies. And an example how mitigation of this of the problems of cultural heritage preservation are implemented, but sometimes also meet their their borders, is this example of the frozen tombs of the Altai Mountains, very famous 2,000-year-old Scythian burials with mummies and all sorts of preserved organic artifacts. And there has been an effort in the 2000s by the UNESCO to document the situation and the endangered situation of this archive, but also to find strategies to preserve them. But unfortunately, this effort has not come beyond the report in the 2000s and 2006, and no real mitigation has been implemented so far. So to sum up my brief summary, Arctic archaeology is a global task, and I would identify 3 major points which we have to bear in mind while taking it on. One of them is the exploration and preservation of the still largely unknown cultural heritage. And by this, we can also try to raise the public awareness and the awareness of the political players. A second important point would be to understand long-term human responses to Arctic climate change and the deeper histories of traditional ways of knowing. And this way, we can hopefully develop alternative sustainable strategies to feed into future mitigation. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this overview. We will now look at specific areas. Dr. Sabine Reinhold, she's a specialist of the Urals. When you visit your sites, can you already see the impact of climate change?
Thank you for having me here as well in this presentation. My topic today will likewise address the issue about how rising temperatures affects and can be expected to affect the archaeological sites in the permafrost areas of northern Eurasia, and that from a point of view of the sources. So I will address also the archaeological heritage, but maybe not that what one would expect. So big monuments, temples, but things like that, what you can see here or in the next slide, the plain archaeological evidence on which we build most of the interpretations of the past, which are maybe not absolutely always in the focus, but which are most informative when we think about how the people have lived their life in the past. So the Arctics and the Eurasian North, the forest zone, is probably not the area where we expect too much of archaeological evidence. We would rather think about wildlife such as reindeer or ice bears that are very much threatened likewise by the melting habitats or by environmental changes. But the Arctics and especially the Arctics has also been for a long time a place for human presence, a place for humans to be there. This environmental zone, for instance, is one of the few that, at least in winter, interlinks the Eurasia and the Northern America without too much geographical boundaries. So it's possible to move. And you see sites like the more than 30,000-year-old Paleolithic mammoth hunter sites in Yakutia, or a Russian trading port from the 16th century. They both, that you can see here on the slides, they both reveal that archaeological sources, that archaeology is present in these areas. It is maybe difficult to access because it's very remote and we cannot so easily get to that, but it is present. And the few glimpses that the archaeology of the Arctics has already added to the perspective of world history is, for instance, a more or a better knowledge on the migration routes into the Americas that were studied also with human genetic remains from Arctic sites. The history of dog domestication is deeply related to Arctic findings, such as the dog puppies that you can see here, and the oldest is meanwhile, I think, 18,000 years old, or as these wooden sledges found nearby dog skeletons on one of the most northern archaeological sites worldwide at Chokov Island, also 8,000 years old. Nobody thought about that these people at that age had already things like dog-drawn sledges. So these are only two spotlights on the significance of the archaeological heritage in these remote areas, which are part of the general processes of human history. And of course, we have to ask why we do have these important findings there. The preservation in permafrost is, let's say, at the basis of this. Preservation in permafrost conditions conserve organic materials like in a big fridge. However, the door of this fridge that preserved all these very nice objects has opened. Temperatures rise in unprecedented speed, tying permafrost and melting down sea ice alike. And this does heavily infect the archaeological heritage, as we see now and as we will also see in the next papers. So rising temperatures increase coastal and riverine erosion. They are melting down the permafrost bodies that have and still conserve the ideal archives of organic material. An easier access to prehistoric relics fosters looting, for instance, of these mammoth bone deposits, which is a huge problem in Siberia. Growing vegetation attacks permafrost sites in summer with roots, starting to decompose the organic materials, which is in the ground both biologically and chemically. And the disintegration of these organics we can predict by inspecting the site preservation along a geographical gradient that is coming from north to south, let's say from sites that have an annual mean temperature of -10 degrees, -6 degrees, or -2.5 degrees minus. The sites that I've shown you, which were excavated in areas with these mean annual temperatures, have been excavated by the heritage organization Sabine Archaeological, to which I'm very much indebted for their very excellent and online available series of presentations on the state of art in the archaeology of the Russian North. As you can see here in permafrost condition, the organic material, and not only the wood, as you can see there here, is preserved in their full structures. Likewise, all the small things like the lost overs, the rubbish, and so on. Only a few hundred kilometers south, with an average 2.5 centigrades higher annual temperature, organic material, as you can see in the middle images, is preserved only when it is burned, when it's charred. All other features are plain so-called mineral soil sites, where only the soil colors indicate ancient structures. This is a loss of 90 or even maybe 99% of the information that was once present. And it is worth noting that according to a prediction of the temperature rise in these areas, the 2.5 annual degree was predicted between 1980 and 2040. And in 2020, we have already arrived at 1 degree plus in annual mean temperatures. So the sites that I've shown you in the Arctics are also preserved in the forest zone, in the tundra, even as mineral soil sites, but you see still these very impressive monuments. They are preserved due to modest wood vegetation, and especially this reindeer moss that conserves the surface erosion. And these monuments are threatened as well. The building of oil rigs, flares, camps, and infrastructure, cutting down and deforestation of large areas in the forest heavily attaches or threatens the vegetation cover. They open up the sandy soils for erosion and destroy all these sites. Rising temperatures and the drainage of the huge meres in this area likewise are affected by increasing wildfires, and thus affect also the waterlogged archaeological heritage in the box. We can find in the box things like these oldest wooden sculpture from a Siberian bog that is also 11,000 years old. It was, thank God, found long ago and is now in the museum. But once such an object is burned down in a mere, it will never have the chance to reappear from the past. And with these rather sad words, I will hand over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you. These were sad perspectives, but beautiful finds you've shown us. Now, following the track of the Paleolithic people from the far north of Siberia over the Bering Strait, we come to Alaska. In what respect is the situation there different from the permafrost in Siberia, Dr. Ann Jensen?
But basically, I'm making the point that archaeology is tangible cultural heritage. That's actually a local resident, Leonard Pitok, working on what is left of a house site out at Nuvuk. This erosion face, basically, I'm standing on the beach of the Beaufort Sea when I took this picture. But it's the heritage of the people who live here. It's also part of World Heritage, but a lot of the world doesn't seem all that interested. but it's also a frozen tissue archive. I think this point has been made with all the pictures of the little little puppies and whatnot, but not only do you get zooarchaeological data, but you can get stable isotopes, you can get ancient DNA, you can do steroids for whether the animals are under stress, you can look at trace elements so you can figure out the structure of caribou herds 5,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago. Obviously, environmental reconstruction and change. This is a profile at Walakpa. The purple arrow over there is pointing at a ice wedge, which is from the Pleistocene. What's underneath that is actually the Gubic Formation, which is a Pleistocene formation. Why is this important? Well, 34% of the world's coastlines are permafrost. The measured erosion rate on these coasts is much higher than that of other coastlines around the world. So we talked about coastal erosion last week. It's worse here by and large. Ice-rich permafrost can be up to 70 or possibly more % of water by volume, but also sea ice could for the coastline. So when that melts, there's a huge issue, obviously. But when sea ice retreat is exacerbating the issue along the coast. So on this slide, you can see a dotted line, blue dotted line, which is actually the edge of the sea ice, but that's the 1979 to 200 average sea ice edge. It used to be much closer. So in the past, sea ice may be pulled back 20 to 30 miles from a coastline, usually not much more. And when the sea ice is on the coast, it protects the coast from erosion, from storms. When it pulls back, if it only pulls back a little way, a storm can only transfer so much wind energy into the water for wave energy. So it limits how much energy gets put against the coast. Now, when you have like the entire Bering Strait open, when you have it pulling thousands of miles back from the coast in some cases, certainly hundreds, most places, the energy which is transferred by an equivalent storm is much, much greater. The other problem is that the ice-free season in many areas has gotten much longer. From here, for example, here in Utqiagvik, the Point Barrow, used to be maximum about 2 months. Now it's more like 8 months and sometimes longer. So, you know, even if the storm regime hadn't changed a bit, you have 4 times as long for storms to actually impact the coast. So couple that with issues like this. So as permafrost degrades, as permafrost melts, there's 2 things that really impact archaeological sites. One is physical damage. So you get thermokarst, where ice wedges like this big ice you can see here, which has actually got 2 features hacked into it, melt. The bottom of this is already melted and it makes basically a hole. And of course, if the site is resting on top of this giant hole in the ground, it collapses into it and you lose your context, you lose your stratigraphy, you lose, you know, everything just is a big jumble. So there's some nice artifacts, but you know, how do they relate? The other thing is niche collapse erosion. And that's basically what happens. And you saw some examples on the rivers. There's some examples on the coast where it gets undercut by wave action or river action. And then there's this big overhanging, shelf of frozen ground that eventually can't stay put. And it gets worse. As as the permafrost warms, chemical and bacterial decay processes will start to accelerate. These are almost, in a lot of cases, they're pretty much have been in stasis since something went in the ground, you know, thousands of years ago. There's a site near Kotzebue up in the mountains where they actually found a 10,000-year-old faunal collection that looked pretty much like it had gone in the ground 10 or 15 years ago, because that apparently been rapidly covered. They were frozen and they stayed that way till they were excavated. The rest of the site didn't have as much organics, but that one did. Anyway, as these processes accelerate, they can eventually become thermogenic. So in other words, they're making their own heat. And they can turn perfectly preserved organic material into bone mush in a generation. There's a perfect example. When Tom McGovern was a graduate student, he was working at a couple of sites in Greenland. The bone preservation was very good. This was in the 1970s. One of his grad students, 30 years later, wanted to go back to the same sites. They had some new questions to ask and they needed to do some new excavation. And there was no preserved bone. It was essentially bone mush. His dissertation topic changed a little, and he and some folks from the Greenland National Museum went to over 100 sites in Greenland that were known to have organic preservation, and they found very few that still did. So it's happening now. So in large parts of Alaska, at least, permafrost degradation is essentially an existential threat to archaeological sites as we've known them. And it's a rapid one. So from Nuvik to Tikiyuk, Nuvik's on the top, Tikiyuk is Point Hope, it's on the bottom and beyond. I last night was thinking and realized that I have spent the last 27 years of my professional career basically digging on erosion faces. I am so tired of it, I can't tell you. The upper picture, we're actually excavating the northernmost Iputak site ever encountered, and in the farthest north that ever will be. If we wanted to go to this spot on the face of the planet today, we would need a boat. On the bottom is Point Hope, the Tikiyuk part of the National Historic Landmark after a storm. I was actually down there for a project to put sandbags in front of this, but this is several houses and ice cellars exposed in the erosion phase. So just one site as an example of how fast this goes. This is Walakpa, which is a fairly well-known site for at least US Arctic archaeologists. Until July, this was just the whole site looked like the top of it. It basically went down to the beach. There was a nice grass-covered stable thing. I was not thinking about working at Walakpa. I was actually worrying about Bernard because this was stable. And then the front fell off after a small storm, July 2013. This is the next year after another storm. This is not just what you saw there falling down. This is 10 meters in from what you just saw in the last picture. So 10 meters of the site disappeared in one storm, just gone. That entire house that you could see in the sort of in the center of the photo underneath the overhanging, gone. You can see in this one, there's plastic sticking out. That is actually the bottom of Dennis Stanford's excavations. When he backfilled, he put that in there. So, so we went down, we did we were able to get some volunteers and a little bit of funding and attempted to do some salvage there. We did in 2015, we did a quick column sample. There was actually another massive storm that took out the area that we sampled. Then we went back, and the organic preservation is exquisite. Upper right-hand corner is one of several mummified seals, which have proven to be quite interesting for the scientists. You've got a Bernard throwing board, perfectly preserved below it. At the bottom there's a couple of interesting polar bear skulls that actually are morphologically different from the ones that are around now, although they're genetically related. In the middle, you see a house tunnel, and you also see another one of the mummified seals there at the top, and then all sorts of exquisitely preserved small things, as well as, of course, structure. Here is the house that was present. You can see a tunnel, which is still partially intact. You could crawl through that tunnel, although I did not permit anyone to do it. This house is probably, although we haven't gotten to the bottom of it, at least 1,200, if not 1,500 years old. The two areas that are outlined in red have been eroded basically, so we're missing part of it. But you can see the preservation is wonderful for as old as it is. And, you know, the finds were all preserved as well. But the philosophy in the North has largely been, particularly from government organizations, that what you do is preserve in place. So the National Park Service and others who controlled sites. The only problem is that has changed. It's now that essentially equals rot in place. Things are rotting in the ground. So they're gradual change, but basically we are in a race, and it's, you know, we don't have a lot of time to recover what information is in these sites before it either rots or is washed away if it's a coastal or riverbank site, which most of the sites are, because that's where people like to live. So I will just say that this has already taken out most of the sites in certain parts of the state. For example, the north coast of Alaska, from Point Barrow to the Canadian border at least. There are very few sites left there. Even sites that were occupied within living memory. I had a friend who just passed away a couple years ago who grew up on that coast. Even 20 years ago, the place where he spent his childhood living in a sod house was a quarter of a mile out to sea. So we are losing huge chunks of it, and we're losing them fast. So
this is in the far north, and not many people have been able to visit the far north, but many of us have been able to see glaciers on holiday trips, skiing or hiking. In old photographs in the tourist shops, one sees that the ice sheets have been vast and they already have shrunken considerably. And it's not just the skiing industry in the Alps that is suffering. These vanishing glaciers and ice patches, what do they mean for archaeology, Dr. Martin Callanan?
Thank you, Mr. Wildermuth. What they mean for archaeology and a whole range of other sciences are they're very important sources of information and new knowledge. And unfortunately, they're disappearing so quick that we're really in a race, in a rescue effort to try and find these sites and to try and recover the finds from them before it's too late. So I want to thank you, Mr. Wildermuth, and the organizers for inviting me. What I thought I would discuss with our guests, our viewers today, is that what is this glacial archaeology business about? What are they doing? Perhaps people are interested in what kind of sites we are working on. What do they look like? How do they work? I thought I would show you some of the finds that we recover, and also say something a little bit about the problems that we are encountering and the challenges that we are facing. If you would ask me what is glacial archaeology, there's so many images, I would try to hold one talk without a picture of the Iceman, if I should be so cheeky. But glacial archaeology is essentially about traces of humans, past human activity that is emerging from melting ice in the mountains. Little patches of snow, little patches of ice in high alpine context. This ice is melting and disappearing, and what emerges from that melting ice are traces of humans and their activities in the past. And this picture, in a way, can capture this moment, this kind of melting moment. In the background, you can see the dirty old ice melting, and you can see the lucky collector, or in this case, the lucky clever archaeologist, who is actually there to capture the moment when the past, in a way, emerges. Glacial archaeology is this science, or this branch of archaeology that is engaged in this effort to try and rescue these finds. It's a scientific discipline. We are engaged in publishing this material. We're trying to secure it for collections. We're trying to make field work methodologies. How can we do it efficiently and quickly? It is also a very important thing that we like to disseminate to the societies around us, not just to our professional colleagues, but also to the communities and societies that we're living in. And here's an example from colleagues here in the south of Norway, where they have made great efforts to try and make people aware of what we are seeing actually in the mountains, the changes that the archaeologists are seeing, and the developments that they observe from year to year. So this is part of this glacial archaeology. And I would also say even all of the speakers tonight probably share this feeling that we have a duty to disseminate our observations and our experiences with the people around us, because the events are happening now, as Anna has said. In my rest of my talk, I must confess that I'm coming from a very Norwegian perspective. But what I'm talking about, glacial archaeology and the finds and the situation that I'm talking about, is very much a global phenomena. There have been very similar finds and discoveries made all over the world in high mountain areas. If you think globally, the finds areas go from Canada, Alaska, North America, in the Rockies, in the Andes, even in any place that you will find high mountains, in the Alps, Italy, Austria, Switzerland, of course. Almost any place that we have colleagues that will look in suitable conditions. And they are finding again and again and again that high alpine areas glaciers, ice patches, snow patches. They have been important for people in the past in many different ways. And that if we have the time and the resources and the opportunity to search there, for sure we will find some traces and learn more about how people use these alpine landscapes. But my presentation is very much based on our local Norwegian finds and the discoveries we've made here and the work that's going on here at the present. But it should be remembered that this is a global ongoing phenomenon. If you should ask me what is a typical glacial archaeological site, I would say that, well, maybe you shouldn't think of like a typical classical glacier, like you think in your head that large, flowing, dynamic glacier like this one. Probably a better kind of a site is a smaller body of ice, a small ice patch or a snow patch in a corner in a mountain somewhere that will survive from year to year. Here you can see the kind of annual process that you have the summer or you have the winter time when the new snow comes and it fills up the snow storage, if you like. But as the snow melts in the summertime, there are certain places in the mountains where the snow from last year survives. And in many cases, it will survive year after year after year until it has actually become ancient ice. And in certain situations in mountain areas, this ice can be thousands of years old. In particularly hot summers, what we are seeing is that even this ancient ice that has been there for hundreds and thousands of years, even now that is starting to melt. So these ice patches have had a situation where they've survived for a long time, but now they are having troubles to survive. So ice patches like this one that we knew were there for 5,000 years, they are starting to disappear. And from year to year, some years are bad years, some years are good years. But from year to year, when we visit the snow patches, sometimes we find this, it's not really a snow patch anymore, but it's just a melting, muddy ice field area that the finds are emerging on. And once they get to this condition, they really melt very quickly. What happens in these instances is actually that the finds, that the objects that people have left there for whatever reason, they actually are literally released from the ice and they fall onto the ground. So here we have a moment where one collector has found a Viking Age arrow with the shaft, and it is actually on its way down this ice patch into the stony foreground. So this is actually the moment, the perfect moment to find the object. And often my colleagues say about this picture that this arrow is in the moment going from heaven to hell, because down here is actually a terrible place for the preservation of objects. So this is the perfect moment that our friend has found this arrow. What makes glacial archaeology special for archaeologists is the preservation. Of course, the ice and the snow is frozen conditions, and it helps to preserve organic shafts, bone points, sinews, and all of this material that we otherwise don't find in mountain areas or in the north. And if we are there in the right moment, as in this case, when the ice retreats back, and you can find objects that are preserved more or less as they were in the moment that they were released. This is a hunting arrow that was actually made from shell, and the collector from Oppdal has found it as the ice retreated back, and he's been lucky enough to be there that season and find it almost completely intact. And part of glacial archaeology in the lucky situations is almost this time machine effect, where the hunter, in this case, 1600 years ago, has released an arrow at a reindeer, and then the next person who sees it is in 2014, and he is the lucky man that who's there when it emerges from the ice. It's really a very close moment with the past. Further south in the north, we have of the south of Norway, we have many examples where our colleagues have been doing systematic surveys over high mountain ice patches. They are finding many different kinds of finds, not just arrows and bows and such, but a whole range of finds that show us the diversity of what people have been doing in the mountains, and also the ingenuity of how they have adapted to these landscapes. We find not just the shoes, as in this case, the previous slide, and their clothes, this wonderfully preserved Iron Age tunic or textiles. But we find also that they have been using of course, skis. They're in Norway, of course, they're using skis, but they've been using skis for transport. And they have also been using these very ingenious scaring sticks. It's a system from that is known from the southern Norway's mountains around Jotunheimen, where they have been funneling. They've been making channels in the mountains where the animals will go towards the hunters who are waiting. And this is very interesting adaptation of the natural landscape, where they are using a kind of a temporary architecture to create a hunting niche for themselves. The archaeologists in the Inland County Council there are finding many examples of these hunting sticks and different variations of the systems. And it's really thousands and thousands of finds each year. In our district, in the museum that we are working in here in central Norway at NTNU, we've been working with local Sami populations in the interior mountains to try and learn something more about how alpine ice has been used by local herders and hunters in the past. And we are finding that there's also a very rich immaterial culture connected to alpine ice in the mountains that would also have got lost if we had not got more interest for it. It's about songs, place names, and ideas about how they should be used. And we are busy trying to collect some of this in partnership with local partners. So this is an example of the kind of finds that we are finding, and it's a kind of representative for the kind of finds that we find globally. People have been using the mountains for hunting, for trapping, for transport, and every time we find new things in new areas, we're learning more and more about how people adapted to the mountains. Finally, I wanted to say a little bit to you about what does it mean for us, the loss of these, or what are the challenges of losing these landscapes. We are more and more realizing that the alpine ice is a very important, not just a cultural archive, but also a local environmental archive. The old ice contains many important information and knowledges for us about the local environments and the development of the ice and the local environment through the whole Holocene. And this archive is disappearing in front of us. In our region, we have recently done a lot of investigations of some local snow patches, and it's becoming clear to us that they have actually stored information there since the last ice age. Not only that, some of the challenges that we are facing, they're great archaeological field challenges. These sites are difficult to locate. They're in very remote areas. They're very hard to get to, and it takes a long time to find productive sites. It also is the case that they have a tendency, all of them, they melt all at the same time, so that you really get your plate full, and it's difficult to handle. It's difficult to plan for. It happens at short notice, these melts. So not only are we have professional systematic surveys going on, but we're very lucky that we're able to recruit very good local collectors and people that are helping the local museums to find these sites and finds.
To move on shortly, so
yeah, I would. I'm almost finished. I would. The final point I would say is that the loss of the ice is also in a broader context. It's a difficult challenge for the societies that have these alpine areas in different economic, social, and cultural ways. Anyway, thank you all for your attention on this topic.
So thank you all for your very interesting presentations. We've seen really beautiful examples of how well permafrost and ice can preserve really old artifacts from human societies thousands of years ago, like no other place on Earth actually can. It's the only place where this kind of preservation is possible. So it's maybe the flashy archaeology is really in the north and up in the mountains and not in the temples in the south. So anyway, so in a way we've learned that the warming is a challenge and it tends to destroy sites, but on the other hand, it exposes new sites and it makes them accessible. So from an archaeological point of view, is global warming a threat, but a gift as well, because it shows you sites where you can dig and try to find important insights? any Piezonka, for example?
Thank you, Mr. Wildermuth, for this question. I mean, we have seen now quite an impressive overview of this incredible cultural heritage which is preserved in the ice and which is coming to light mainly because of the climatic change in many places, in the glaciers, but also in the permafrost regions, in lower lying areas. But I must say I'm in two minds about this. I mean, it's clear that there is two sides to the story, but we have seen now in these talks that the amount and the sheer the amount and dimension of what is going to be destroyed by the global warming is by no means outweighed by the few insights we can manage to get in our, well, mainly underfunded and well, mostly rescue excavation type efforts to find out something. So I must say, I cannot be happy about this, that we find these nice things melting out of the ice.
Any other perspectives on these questions, if there's a chance in global warming as well, Jensen?
Well, I agree. It's not something you can be happy about. I dropped the whole part of my talk for time, but there's the issue really becomes, because this is happening so fast, how do you respond? I mean, Martin alluded to that in his talk. You know, you find something, but you can't get the funding. I mean, funding cycles are it's a year, it's 2 years before you actually have the money to do something. Well, it's gone by then. That little excavation that I showed you with the Aputac stuff, we actually did GPR that same season and found 4 or 5 in a row inland, what would have lined up with a beach ridge returns, which were probably additional Aputac houses. We tried to get funding that year, did not get funding. Some of the reviews were pretty silly, like, why didn't you dig it up to see what it was? Well, that we didn't have the money. And by the time, but resubmit, well, I didn't resubmit that proposal because it all washed away the next year. We lost about 30 meters in a big storm there. So it was gone, and that just keeps happening. I could go on for 10 minutes about cases like that. So we just, it's you see these wonderful things and you can't get them. Martin alluded to the fact that when it's melting everywhere and you can't get to all of them. And fortunately, they have people who can help, but it's actually incredibly frustrating and it's a huge loss. If anybody has a solution, I'd love to know.
There is one perhaps positive aspect to the melting is that I often think that it's a case of the periphery or bites back because a lot of these places are alpine places and Arctic coastal zones are along far away from the central civilizations, if you like, where there's been a lot of attention and a lot of money channeled and a lot of focus. But the tops of frozen mountains and frozen coastlines are not the places where we have most data from before. And actually, when these frozen contexts are melting, we're actually getting some very, very high grade information and data from, which is really improving our knowledge about certain areas and zones. And there's a kind of a paradox actually in some regions that you have better dates from the top of high alpine mountains than you do from the valleys that are surrounding them. So, there are some certain sort of positives that you can be gotten from these events. But, archaeologists that are standing there, they're part of the society around them too. So we have kids, families, and all these things. So we see the changes directly. And of course, we're worried about what we're seeing.
Just to say to the audience, please feel free to start asking your questions using either the chat in Zoom or using Facebook, Twitter, whatever you like. We will try to weave your questions into the discussion. Professor Callanan, you just said it's a periphery, but some activities, high-end activities, are taking place in these remote areas. The search for oil, for example, there's a huge skiing industry, though there is not only the issue of warming, but it's a exploitation as well. So is this a second threat to the same fragile sites?
I think that the pressure of these threats is probably different from region to region. I imagine the problem is greater in, for example, Central Europe in the Alps. That as you get milder conditions, there'll be more and more pressure upwards into the mountains, and increased building and with more tourism and so on. This might not be the case in the more northern areas. In some respects, one of the challenges, or at least for our alpine archaeology or glacial archaeology, has been to try and make people aware of what they could see or what they could observe while they are there. So, and also in the Alps, in the European Alps, I know that people have been trying to use the fact that there are more tourists and more hikers, there are more people, there are more eyes on the ground, if you like. And there's been some nice projects in Switzerland, and among other places, giving information to the people that are going from cabin to cabin, for example. So we're complaining already about the resources and so on, but we are also having people that have good ideas and ingenious innovations. So maybe we can use this increased activity somehow to help us secure the information and the finds.
Is the oil industry in Siberia a partner of archaeologists? So you can use their resources to get to faraway places? Sabine, Reinhold?
It's the same kind of paradox. The archaeology, the exploitation requires a kind of rescue excavations. That's an old law in Russia, and it is conducted and in the oil area of Khanty-Mansiysk region. About 2,000 rescue excavations have been carried out within the last, I don't remember exactly, 5 or 6 years. On the other hand, if the oil industry would not move towards these areas, the archaeological heritage would stay in the ground. And from an archaeological heritage point of view, each archaeological site that stays in the ground, stays in the archive where it was, where it is, as long as the archive is preserved, as the conditions of the archive is preserved. The environment is a better archive than something that is destroyed and where you pick out the findings. To work in these areas in a scientific way needs, as Jensen already pointed out, much longer planning, and it needs a research strategy, it needs a funding body, and it needs also research questions. So we cannot address too much research questions to sites that are disappearing quicker than our applications come. However, without, let's say, the oil industry, no archaeology, at least in Russia, no archaeology would be taking part in these areas at all. I don't know how it's in Alaska or in Norway, but except of them, nobody threatens the area. The reindeer herders, they move along these sites. Sometimes they pick up a virus, as to 2016, where in Yamal Peninsula, the reindeer herd picked up one of these emerging viruses, but they don't threaten, let's say, the landscape and the heritage. So it's the twofold question, like before.
You just mentioned this balance. On the one hand, you have this rescue excavation, some site threatened, and you go there and you try to get the funding in time. But on the other side, it would be better to have a strategy for the whole area. So is this possible? Is there funding for large-scale strategies to try to find the relevant sites before they are threatened and try to get an excavation going before everything goes down the drain?
Well, I think the only thing that I know about is this program in the Alps, and that program that is headed by Martin Callanan, where they are looking on the ice patches. And in the Alps, well, as he said already, the infrastructure is much better. So there are much more people up there in these areas. But to monitor the entire permafrost area in the Eurasian continent or the Americas would be a task for, I don't know, many millions of archaeologists with a lot of funding, with a lot of techniques. So the few people that are working there, the few people that are involved also with the local population and try to get information, they are like islands in a big ocean.
But Henny, Piezonka, is it feasible to map, I don't know, with a satellite, try to find where's a big site and go with all the resources there in a site that is still preserved and still can give all the information that is buried in the ground there, instead of going to accidental find where an oil company decides to go to do a well?
Well, as for example, Sabine Reinhold has shown, but also Martin Callanan and Jensen, in many cases, because of this incredible preservation, we can actually locate archaeological sites by surface features, and of course satellite imagery and also airborne laser scanning, for example, might actually help to locate these places. But and then there could be excavations implemented, bearing in mind the problems Anne Jensen mentioned, that sometimes the destruction is faster than the funding bodies can react. So yes, it's possible to do Arctic archaeology beyond this rescue excavation scheme, which is resulting from the industrial processes there, for example. But as we have said, we will only ever reach by this way very, very small parts of this still preserved heritage. And in this case, I must say there is maybe one other positive aspect of the melting of this cultural heritage and of it being exposed, which is our possibility to use it to show the urgency of implementations, of better funding, of political actions concerning the heritage, but connected to this, of course, also raising awareness of the disappearing lifeways of traditional people, of indigenous groups who are also very much affected by these processes. And in fact, since these are current and contemporary societies, this might even be the more important aspect rather than the old albeit really nice heritage, but we can use it hopefully. And I think this is a future trajectory we have to follow to show the urgency of taking action, political action really.
So, and Jensen, when the people who are living in Alaska now, do they have a relation to the finds you're digging up, which are thousands of years old from the Ice Age or even older?
Absolutely. Well, I work onto, for example, Nuvok, we had everything from the Putek component, which was actually the earliest dated Putek component known yet, 300 to 400 AD, all the way up to the Nuvok cemetery. The village of Nuvok was known historically and even shows up in early US censuses. That had all eroded by the time anybody realized that there was actually not just a relatively recent village. But the cemetery continued, and there's actually people from the last iteration of the village buried there, who have graves markers and everything from the 1920s and 30s. So yeah, and there's families that are related to those people. We did most of the work out there actually with, I had a really cool funding program that actually let me hire local students, local high school students. So most of the crew was actually local high school students. And I usually try to hire a few local people. It's a little tough because the wages up here are extremely high. So I can either hire somebody with a master's degree and many years of excavation experience, or I can hire somebody who's never excavated before in their life for the same money. And if you're in a situation where you're trying to go really fast, but you want to do a good job and collect the data because it's the only data we're ever going to get from a site, that's a tough balancing act. But no, people are very related to these sites. This is their heritage. It's very powerful for kids to be able to go and stand on the floor of a house, of a semi-subterranean house. I've seen it happen. Their grandparents or their great-grandparents have told them about growing up in a place like that, but you can just see the light bulb going on for them when they actually see what it was like, they actually experience it. And that's going to go away. You know, their grandkids are not going to be able to have that experience because they're not going to be any left. You know, to the part about remote sensing, yeah, if the data is good enough, there's parts of Alaska where you can look, you know, you could, the sat and aerial imagery is good enough that you can see individual sod houses and even individual smaller features. Here we don't have that, at least available to, even to scientists with special permission. I mean, I'm sure that, you know, I'm sure the federal government and probably the Russian government as well could, you know, they've probably got the imagery that we could, you know, look at things this size and find them, but that's not something we can access. And the thing that we don't have we have a hard time with is not here. The winter houses are big semi-subterranean things. They make mounds. There's clusters of mounds. It's things like cemeteries. It's things like, where did people go in the summer? They often, you know, we know from stories and whatnot, and just, you know, historical observation, that people often dispersed in the land. They were living in tents. That doesn't show up easily on a satellite photograph. Really early sites, you know, even with our great organic preservation, you may be down to stone tools. It's much more like, you know, what you experience in you know, more southerly. I've dug in Luxembourg and Denmark and you know, a lot of Pennsylvania, and, you know, you get stone tools and that, and stains in the ground, you know, just mineral staining, and that's it. That isn't going to get picked up on sat photographs or even aerial stuff, and that's where the oil companies fall down. I actually have gotten emails during this, because one of my jobs is the county archaeologist, so to speak, and the county's the size of Minnesota, and I've been getting emails during this about a particular survey that wants to proceed.
Yeah, now questions from the audience. Yes, Marcus Reinhold asks, on the same vein, is it possible to use geophysical prospection techniques to detect archaeological context and objects enclosed, for example, in ice? Could this be a way to discover them before they show up, and be ready and be there when they really show up, Professor Callanan?
It's a good suggestion, Marcus. The idea is that if we do indeed have technologies that you can, the ice is a nice medium or a nice material to use for georadar or for other techniques, and that you can get detailed pictures over the ice itself and what is inside the ice and structures within it before it melts. Actually, the geophysics is quite an important method now for documenting how much ice is on a different site. And many researchers, if they have the funding, they will try and do a georadar survey on a site, so that they can at least document that in, for example, 2015, there was so many cubic meters of ice there. And they can get an idea of the layering and so on within the ice. I think depending on the materials that you would suspect to find, if for example you're talking about wooden shafts and textiles and you know, antler points and so on, I think the organic materials may be hard to find within a large ice patch or a snow body. But theoretically, at least, I think that if you're looking at metal arrowheads and that have a, you know, they have a reflective signal, I think that there should be a possibility that you should be able to find them and excavate them from the ice. And I think as Marcus is talking about there, it is actually would be quite the advantage if you could get them before, because the better condition they are in once you recover them, the less money you have to spend on conservation and treatment in the lab afterwards. So there is actually an economy here that if we invested money in rescuing these sites early enough, we wouldn't have to spend the money in the collections and in the conservation lab afterwards.
So I encourage the audience again, ask your questions. This is now the chance. So we now have heard about the problems of conservation after you dig out a site. I wonder, what can you do when you know of a site which is melting, which is going to the sea? How can you can't preserve the site, you can't put a big freezer on it and keep it in the ground. So what can you actually do? What is necessary to get enough or the most of the information out in a very fast time? Maybe you can share your experiences, what is essential. Sabine, Reinhold?
Yeah, maybe I answer for the sites that I have shown, and this company that also do some kind of basically rescue excavations. They have started to to take a good deal of the material out and conserve that in big conservation structures. That is absolutely exceptional, and it is there are very few of these big conservation facilities that can conserve wooden artifacts, for instance, not of a size of this size, but an entire beam that a house is built of. We have now been recently in the Altai Mountains and saw these the remains of the famous Pasiric ice kurgans that were excavated in the 1930s. And now they have re-excavated them, and they want to preserve the entire material in the museum. It is a huge mound of still perfectly and very well preserved woods. So they have the chance to do that. But if we think about a small site with organic preservation and we excavate all of them, we have maybe 100,000, maybe 500,000 items to restore. And that is a huge money. And that is also a huge need for storage facilities, for display facilities. On the other hand, we can show things that nobody can show. These frozen mammoths, for instance, or the small bone tools that we saw from Alaska that are present also in Siberia, that are of an exquisite level of art, for instance, that is really worth to be shown in the best museums worldwide. And that is one of the ongoing things that happens now. I just looked it up. There is at the moment museums exhibition in the British Museum starting with focusing on the Arctic, and in Chemnitz there is scheduled exhibition on Arctic archaeological finds within the next years. So the money that would be needed to expose or to present these remains is very large after even we have excavated them, even if we are managed to rescue the items and the things. It's really a huge amount of money, of labor, of time to be invested to get information out of it.
So is the only solution to fight for climate mitigation and to cut back on global CO2 emissions? Or you paint a very bleak picture. So is there any bright spot? For example, is archaeology a way to raise awareness of the problem of climate change?
Yeah, that I think is the case. We obviously need to work on mitigation just because we need to work on mitigation, because otherwise, it's going to be, otherwise I'd be 10 feet underwater right now in a couple hundred years sitting where I'm sitting. So, but it's not going to be fast enough for the sites here. I mean, if we stopped emitting carbon today, there is so much lag time, and I work with a lot of climate scientists. So, it's going to keep warming and warming and warming for decades and decades. So I've been lucky in that I've had access to a couple of minus 40 Celsius freezers, so we can bring a lot of stuff, send it in from the field and stuff it in the freezer, but gradually we have to bring it out because, hey, there's always more stuff coming, and other people need the freezer too. We don't conserve bones because they're usually in good enough shape. So I work in a state where there are 2, maybe 3 conservators, all of whom work at a museum. So yeah, they aren't really available to come out to the field. And they not only have to deal with all the archaeological material, but they also have to deal with massive ethnographic collections. And so, getting a conservator is really difficult. We are very short of conservators in the United States, I will say. You know, I've been lucky enough to get a couple to come up, and it's been great, but you can't always, you know, just get one to come to the field and you know, have an ongoing field lab or an ongoing lab while you're excavating. So, you know, you have to do the best you can preserving it. You know, we take massive soil samples, we screen everything, you know, but still, yeah, there's a little triage going on, and there's just no way around it. And then, you know, you have to get it from the field because we don't have a place to store it that has climate control. And once it's got to go out of the lab, we have to ship it to Fairbanks, which is air freight and everything else. I have 4 pallets right now waiting to get air freighted out of here, from Volkart, actually. You know, that's all the not super delicate stuff that's going to get transported by hand, but when we can transport it by hand. So it's a real tear. I mean, and the museums often, I actually was discussing in a section by museum people, and they all said, "Oh, stop digging, you know." And I was like, "We're getting too much stuff," and it's like, well, we can't, because we can't dig it up in 20 years because it's not going to be there. And that wasn't something that most of them had even thought about or realized. So
it's the backside of the medal, isn't it? That because when everyone is saying that it's high quality data, it's unique finds and a great knowledge potential in it for dating isotopes and chemical analysis, and all in the future what they will be able to analyze these finds and what they will be able to discover. Of course, these are all very high cost finds as well, difficult to preserve, difficult to store. But we believe that many of them are so unique, and especially in local context, that it's worth the effort and it's worth the expense. So, you know, even from the field and for the institutions, I think a part of this frozen heritage work is to find sustainable methods and solutions, and in this rescue work, you know, that we can do it within the frameworks and within the budgets that we have.
There's now a question from Farron Antolin. He says, I never got the message this clear that Arctic archaeology is such a priority for humanity nowadays at so many levels. Do you have experience of contacting politicians or policymakers about it? Are they willing to support this kind of research?
Yeah, maybe I can answer for that, because we had, together with Henny Piezonka, just in the end of the last year, meeting with local officials and with museums peoples in Anti-Mansisk region that were exactly addressing these questions. How can we support their efforts in the limited rescue excavation that they can do, and what can we do? And in fact, one of the things that we can do as a scientific institute, as a university or the DAI, is to support the scientific work on these materials. Because to excavate them, you have to be there. You have to be at the spot or nearby. But and you have heard that the masses accumulation, the masses accumulate in finds. But what the people that are, let's say, in the front of the excavations rarely can do is to do all the scientific stuff, the investigation, into the dating, all these information, extract the information from all these things what Jensen has shown, which is there as an information. And that is something where we can, as scientific institutions, support the people that have excavated these sites. And in fact, that was one of the ideas in the talks to the responsible officials. And let's say the fact that an institute like Martin Callanan's exists mean already that there is an awareness in the local politicians. And I think a meeting like that, an information event like that, might also raise the awareness. Exhibitions raise the awareness. And then we can really hope, together with the environmentalists that are now very much focusing on the Arctic. Just last week, the polar expedition from the Alfred Wegener Institute returned with masses of data. And of course, together with these people from the environmental side, we might have a chance to get a maximum of information from that what can be rescued. But I share a more pessimistic view. The environmental factors have started, so the decay has started. It will not stop, even if we should have would close this door of the fridge. That means to lower down my annual temperature about 5 degrees, and then it might be stopping, but the process have started, and I don't see that they stop, even if we stop changing even more the climate.
Maybe if I may add two little aspects concerning the future directions from my point of view to Sabine's words. In my mind, the archaeologists are not doing enough, but have not succeeded to really transport the urgency enough into society and into politics. I mean, my little survey of the internet sort of news showed what is interesting for the public is the spooky thing with these viruses, but the heritage point of view is not so much present in the awareness of the public, and hence maybe also not so much in the awareness of the politics and the political players who have better possibilities to do something. So we have to do some lobbyism here, I think. And the other point of view I would like to also raise here is concerning this this political dimension. Again, archaeology here, especially in this way, as Sabine, for example, described it, and also Anne, has this dimension of interacting with indigenous communities and helping their political causes with our possibilities of showing the importance of understanding these traditional lifeways, because they are sustainable lifeways, and they can be developed as an alternative in part to this unleashed and unlimited industrialization, for example. So these two aspects, we have to transport more of our case into politics, and we have to bear in mind indigenous groups and alternative ways of life in the future.
Can we learn something about how Paleolithic or later groups coped with local warming from your archaeological sites, which we might apply to our situation with the much broader warming we have to face?
Yeah, I think so. Some of the European data goes back further here, particularly for coastal sites, because before about 5,000 years ago, the Bering Strait was it's been closing gradually. So we don't really see coastal cultures before about 5,000 years ago, because that's when the current coastline stabilized. Before that, they were in what's now underwater, and nobody's between sea ice kind of raking the bottom of the ocean, and obviously disturbing sites in a major way, and the fact that it's just nasty to dive in. I don't think anybody's ever going to go looking for those sites. So, we have a slightly more limited time depth, but yes, it can tell us things. I mean, there's even in the United States, there's, you've got the Little Ice Age, it's actually a period of disruption from the desert Southwest all the way up to here. I mean, you get warring, you get, people start using arrows and, slat armor and on and on and on, so people really, you can see that there are major disruptions associated with climate change, sort of, I think a knock-on effect, somebody has a problem and then they, go to where, and, bother their neighbors, and their neighbors go bother their neighbors, and it just reverberates. It's also really, I find useful, and I'm working with some folks in other states about this as well, because we kind of do this on a state-by-state basis. It's also really useful for getting people to pay attention to disasters, kind of things that have a very long return period, so they don't exist in living memory. So we've had a couple of a couple of really bad storm surge events in this area. And one of them is in living memory of people my age, but they tend to think of it as a one-off. Well, that Iputak place that we were excavating, that was actually catastrophically terminated by an even bigger storm surge event. It clearly washed everything away, and they didn't come back and get their wooden stuff, which suggests that they couldn't, because wood is a really precious resource up here. So that actually was fascinating, how it got the younger people's attention, like, oh my gosh, this can happen again, because it's happened at least twice now that we know about. So that kind of thing can be a really great object lesson. And we've been able to get other people's attention that way, and start helping move toward planning for the eventuality of that kind of an event happening with our modern infrastructure. So I think that can happen. You know, it becomes difficult. I have more, I think the US is probably less likely for this to work than probably a lot of Europe, because you seem to be a little more sensible. Our local government, which is mostly indigenous, I mean, this is an indigenous community that I live in, and the North Slope government is largely composed of indigenous Inupiaq people. They actually have, when they have the spare funds, contributed to doing archaeology at these sites. The state government is all about oil. They don't care. And actually, most of the archaeologists in the state aren't terribly worried about permafrost either. I you know, keep talking about it at our state archaeological meetings, and we don't get a lot of traction. It's changing, but you know, people are quite resistant here to acknowledging it, because so much of everything depends on oil, you know, and if you admit that carbon's a problem, you've just admitted that oil is a problem.
So just the audience, you still have chance to ask your questions. I encourage you to type in the chat or whatever medium you use. We will pick it up right now. But Professor Callanan, you wanted to join?
Yeah, it was interesting to go back to the political question. There is a kind of a question of kind of equity or justice with this carbon perspective too, because in many respects the effects of these changes in the environment, local environments, the loss of ice, the loss of alpine ice, permafrost, and so on, they are affecting these, you know, the remote communities that are actually probably among the people that have released least carbon into the system. And that they have, in the work we've been doing, for example, in the southern Sami areas, that these snow and ice areas are very important for, not just for the economy and for herding and so on, but for, you know, the local sense of landscape and identity and so on. And I think that, you know, our work towards politicians and authorities, it shouldn't just have an economic motive. Is to also highlight the other values that this loss has, you know, that there are social values and cultural values that are being lost as well. And that I think that our lobbying work has got to sort of highlight those aspects too. There's a kind of an equity aspect to this work, that the people are being affected in all these different ways in, you know, what can be remote sites, away from the parliaments and away from the corridors of power, that we make make this clear to the decision makers.
This is in some aspects quite successful. For example, the Iceman Ötzi was a big news, and everyone was very interested, and the museum was built. So that was one focus point for glacial archaeology, which at least got the interest of politicians as well, I think. And when Sabine Reinhold told that there are major exhibitions in London and in Germany coming up showing Arctic finds, there seems to be the chance to keep to put it in the spotlight in a way. So do you first have to convince other archaeologists that Arctics is really the place to dig, and then to go to the politicians and convince them, okay, now that all the scientists are of this opinion, now get the funding?
Well, I suppose if Ötzi would have not been found at one of the most frequented touristic routes in the Alps. Nobody, this rocket-like uptake of the Alpine archaeology, which really happened after the finding, would not have taken the place. I think nobody knows about the ice mummy found in 2016 in Yamal Peninsula, which is maybe even better preserved. But we have a chance to make, as we said already several times, to make the awareness. And I'm quite sure that events like this and also presenting more on this at normal archaeological conferences will convince the archaeologists quite quickly, because archaeologists know what it does mean if you lose information due to decay. That is we know what we will deal with if we don't do something like that. To convince politicians is much more difficult, and I place much more hope in shoulder to shoulder to go with the environmental specialists, the Arctic climate research groups, and to convince them, not the politicians, but to convince, let's say, the people that are doing this Arctic research, that the heritage, the cultural heritage, is not less important than the archives in the ice or the isotopes or the charcoal, micro charcoal put out of an ice core. And if we can convince them, they have a much better standing with the politicians, and we can also make a point to have a cultural aspect in the research on the northern areas in Eurasia, in the Americas.
Yeah, I've learned a lot in this session about how important the archaeology of the far north and the archaeology of glaciers and ice patches is, and what wonderful finds can be made there. And I'll be sure to go to this exhibition, at least to the one in Germany. Don't know about London yet. So I think you made a great case for it. And luckily the last ground check discussion will not be with scientists on the panels, but with politicians from Germany. So you can raise awareness right at the point where decisions are made. So I would thank you, all the speakers and the audience, for your questions. And I want to invite you to the next ground check discussion, the closing event, and be aware it's not happening next Wednesday, but it's happening on Thursday. So it's Thursday, the 29th of October at 6 p.m. at the usual place in the internet. It's a virtual discussion as well. We will review all the discussions we had and try to bring the key points to the politicians. And I'm very keen and very interested to hear what they think they can contribute to the heritage which is still available and which can still be preserved. So thank you for your interest in the ground check discussions, and have a nice evening. See you next week.